At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law whispered, "Don't worry, she's not in the will." But she had no idea what was coming. I was standing there in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 5 years ago, clutching a tissue that had long since become useless. The September rain drummed against the funeral home windows, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and grief. My husband of 32 years, Robert, lay in that mahogany casket, and I felt like half of my soul had been buried with him. That's when I heard it. I had stepped away from the main viewing area to get some air, ducking into the small side room where the family had left their coats and purses. I thought I was alone with my sorrow, trying to compose myself before facing another round of condolences from people who barely knew Robert but felt obligated to appear. But I wasn't alone. Through the thin wall, I could hear voices from the adjacent family lounge, voices I recognized all too well. My stepdaughter Sarah's voice, sharp and calculating as always. And then Jessica, my daughter-in-law, Robert's son Michael's wife, speaking in that honeyed tone she reserved for family gossip. "I'm telling you, Sarah, stop worrying," Jessica was saying, her voice barely above a whisper but crystal clear to my ears. "Michael confirmed it with Dad just last month. She's not in the will. After 30 years of marriage, and she gets nothing." My heart stopped. "Are you sure?" Sarah's voice was eager, hungry. "Because if that woman thinks she's getting her hands on Dad's estate after swooping in and stealing him from Mom—" "Trust me," Jessica interrupted with a laugh that made my blood freeze. "Your father was smarter than that. Blood is blood. She was just convenient. Someone to take care of him in his old age." I pressed my back against the wall, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. Convenient. Through 3 decades of love, laughter, midnight conversations, and holding his hand through chemotherapy treatments, I was just convenient. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. "Do you know how much the house alone is worth? And his investments, the life insurance? Michael said there's at least 2 million, maybe more. Split 3 ways between you, Michael, and David," Jessica added. "Just like it should be. His real children. Real children." The words hit me like daggers to the chest. I thought about all those years, helping with homework, attending school plays, driving to soccer practice, nursing scraped knees, celebrating graduations. I thought about the Mother's Day cards that stopped coming when they got older, the Christmas dinners where I felt more like the hired help than family, the way they'd exchange glances when I tried to contribute to conversations about the old days, the days before I existed in their world. "The lawyer said the will reading is next Tuesday," Sarah continued. "We should all be there, of course, to make it official. But Jessica, you're right, she has no idea what's coming. She probably thinks she's going to be taken care of." They laughed then. Both of them. Soft, satisfied chuckles that made my stomach turn. I stood there in that coat room, surrounded by the scent of wet wool and expensive perfume, listening to the 2 women plan their inheritance while my husband's body lay cold in the next room. Tissue in my hand was shredded now, small white pieces falling to the burgundy carpet like snow. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what they couldn't possibly have imagined as they sat there dividing up their future riches. Robert and I had spent the last 6 months of his life having very different conversations than the ones they thought we were having. Very different conversations indeed. As I listened to them discuss which of Robert's belongings they wanted to claim first, his watch, his golf clubs, even his vintage car collection, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, raw and overwhelming, but alongside it grew something else. Quiet, burning determination. Because while they were planning their celebration, they had no idea that Robert had been planning something entirely different. Something that would change everything. I smoothed down my black dress, wiped my eyes one final time, and walked back into that viewing room with my head held high. I accepted more condolences, shook more hands, and listened to more stories about what a wonderful man my husband had been. And through it all, Sarah and Jessica stood there beside me, playing the part of grieving family members, already counting money they would never see. The will reading was in 6 days. They thought they knew what was coming. But they had no idea what Robert and I had really been planning in those final months of his life. No idea at all. To understand why their words cut so deep, you need to know what those 30 years really meant. What I gave up. What I built. What I loved. I was 28 when I met Robert at a charity fundraiser in 1991. He was 42, recently divorced, and struggling to raise 3 children on his own. Sarah was 15 and angry at the world. Michael was 12 and desperately trying to be the man of the house. David was only 8, still crying for his mother every night. Robert was brilliant, an architect who designed some of the most beautiful buildings in our city. But he was drowning, working 16-hour days to keep his firm afloat while trying to be both mother and father to 3 broken children. When I saw him that night, juggling a business conversation while simultaneously helping David tie his shoes and reminding Sarah about her curfew, something in my heart just knew. I wasn't looking for love. I had just finished my master's degree in education and was planning to travel, maybe teach abroad. I had dreams of seeing the world, writing a novel, living an independent life. But sometimes love doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it just arrives and changes everything. Our first date was supposed to be dinner. Instead, I ended up in his kitchen at 7 in the morning, helping him pack 3 different lunches while he frantically searched for Michael's science project and Sarah's permission slip for a field trip. David had spilled orange juice all over his homework, and Sarah was having a meltdown about her hair. Most women would have run. I stayed. I stayed through Sarah's teenage years, when she screamed at me that I wasn't her mother and never would be. I stayed when Michael broke his arm and cried for someone who wasn't there, and I held him in that emergency room until the pain medication kicked in. I stayed when David had nightmares and crawled into our bed, needing comfort from the only mother figure he really remembered. When Robert and I married 2 years later, I knew exactly what I was signing up for. I wasn't just marrying him, I was choosing to love 3 children who had every reason to resist me. I traded my dreams of travel and independence for soccer practices and parent-teacher conferences. I turned down job opportunities in other cities because the kids needed stability. I used my inheritance from my grandmother to help pay for Sarah's college tuition when Robert's business hit a rough patch. But I didn't see it as sacrifice. I saw it as building a family. I was there for every milestone. Sarah's high school graduation, even though she wouldn't let me in the family photos. Michael's college acceptance letter, I was the one who cried happy tears with him because Robert was stuck in a business meeting. David's first heartbreak at 16, when he finally let me hold him while he cried over a girl who didn't love him back. I learned to cook Robert's favorite meals, memorized how he liked his coffee, rubbed his shoulders after long days at the office. When his firm struggled during the 2008 recession, I went back to work full-time as a teacher to help keep us afloat. I never complained about the stress, the tight budget, or the fact that my own dreams kept getting pushed further into the future. When the kids grew up and moved out, I thought we'd finally have our time. Robert and I. We talked about traveling, about the novel I still wanted to write, about finally taking that honeymoon we'd never been able to afford. We had plans. Then came the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The doctor's words echoed in that sterile office like a death sentence, and I watched my husband, this strong, brilliant man who had built skyscrapers and raised 3 children, crumble before my eyes. For 18 months, I became his everything. His nurse, his advocate, his hope when he had none left. I learned to give injections, to manage feeding tubes, to hold him when the pain was too much to bear. I slept in hospital chairs for weeks at a time. I researched every treatment, every clinical trial, every possible miracle. Children visited, of course. Dutiful visits on weekends, awkward conversations about work and weather while their father grew thinner and paler in that hospital bed. But when visiting hours ended, they went home to their own lives. I stayed. I was the one who held his hand during the worst of the chemotherapy. I was the one who helped him to the bathroom when he was too weak to walk alone. I was the one who read to him when he couldn't sleep, who brought him ice chips when his mouth was too sore to eat, who advocated with doctors when they wanted to give up. Sarah came to visit twice during those final months. Michael called every few weeks. David sent flowers and promised to visit soon, but soon never came. But I was there. Every single day. Every sleepless night. Every moment of pain and fear and heartbreak. In those final weeks, when Robert was too weak to leave the house, something beautiful happened. The walls came down. We talked about everything, our regrets, our dreams, our love for each other and for his children. We laughed about the chaos of those early years when I was learning to be a stepmother and he was learning to be a husband again. And we talked about the future. My future. What would happen to me when he was gone? "They don't see you," he whispered to me one evening in August, his voice barely audible. "They don't see what you've given up, what you've done for this family. They don't see how much I love you." I thought he was just emotional, scared about leaving me alone. I told him not to worry, that the children would take care of me, that we were family now. He just looked at me with those tired blue eyes and said, "Margaret, my love, you're going to be surprised." I didn't understand what he meant then. But sitting in that funeral home, listening to Jessica and Sarah dismiss 30 years of my life as convenient, I was beginning to understand. Robert had seen. He had always seen. And he had planned accordingly. The funeral ended, but my real education in my family's true nature was just beginning. The reception was held at our house, the house I had called home for 3 decades, where I had hung every picture, chosen every piece of furniture, planted every flower in the garden. As I moved through the rooms, accepting condolences and serving food I had prepared with shaking hands, I began to notice things I had been too grief-stricken to see before. The way Sarah walked through the living room, her eyes cataloging everything like an appraiser. How she lingered by Robert's antique desk, running her fingers over the mahogany surface with a possessive familiarity. When her friend Carol complimented the beautiful oil painting above the fireplace, the one Robert and I had bought on our 10th anniversary trip to Italy, I heard Sarah respond, "Yes, it's been in our family for years. It'll look perfect in my new house." Our family. As if I had never existed. Michael was more subtle but no less calculating. I caught him in Robert's study, supposedly looking for important documents, but his eyes kept drifting to the rare book collection, the vintage globe, the expensive camera equipment Robert had loved. When I offered to help him find what he needed, he quickly closed the desk drawer he'd been examining and gave me that practiced smile, the one I now realized he'd been using on me for years. "Just trying to understand Dad's filing system," he said smoothly. You know how he was about organization. But I knew that filing system better than anyone. I had organized it. I had helped Robert set up every folder, every account, every important document. Michael was fishing, and we both knew it. David, sweet David, whom I had raised from 8 years old, broke my heart the most. I found him in the garage, staring at Robert's classic car collection, 3 vintage Corvettes that Robert had restored over the years. David didn't even notice I was there until I spoke. "He loved working on those cars," I said softly. "Remember how you used to hand him tools when you were little?" David jumped, startled, then gave me a guilty look. "Oh, hi, Margaret. I was just remembering." But on his phone screen, I could see he had been researching classic car values. Remembering, indeed. The worst part wasn't what they were doing, it was how they were doing it. Right in front of me, as if I were invisible. As if I were already gone. Later that evening, after the last guests had left, the 3 siblings gathered in the kitchen while I cleaned up in the dining room. They thought the distance and the running water would mask their conversation. They were wrong. "The house alone has to be worth at least $800,000, Sarah was saying. "Maybe more in this market." "And the cars," David added. I looked them up. The 67 Stingray alone is worth 60 grand. "What about his life insurance?" Michael asked. "And his 401k? His investment portfolio?" "Jessica thinks it's around 2 million total," Sarah replied. "Maybe more. Dad was always smart with money." "Thank God he was smart about other things too," Michael said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. I was worried after he married her that she might have influenced him. Please, Sarah scoffed. Dad wasn't stupid. He knew what she was. What she was. What I was according to them. A gold digger who got lucky, David said quietly, and hearing those words from the little boy I had tucked into bed, whose nightmares I had chased away, whose broken heart I had mended, it nearly brought me to my knees. She probably thought she hit the jackpot, Sarah continued. Marry the lonely widower, play stepmother for a few years, then cash in when he dies. They laughed. All three of them. Soft, knowing chuckles that echoed through my kitchen, the kitchen where I had made them countless meals, packed countless lunches, celebrated countless birthdays. Well, she's in for a rude awakening Tuesday, Michael said. Blood is blood. Dad knew that. I almost feel sorry for her, David said, though his tone suggested otherwise. 30 years of playing house, and for what? For free room and board, Sarah replied sharply. And plenty of nice things along the way. She's lived well off our father's money. It's time for the real family to inherit what's rightfully ours. The real family. I stood there in my own dining room, holding a stack of plates that suddenly felt impossibly heavy, listening to the three people I had loved as my own children dismiss my entire adult life as an elaborate con game. But what hurt most wasn't their greed, it was their certainty. The absolute confidence in their voices that Robert had never truly loved me, never truly considered me family, never truly intended for me to be taken care of after his death. Had I been that blind? Had 30 years of marriage been built on a foundation of lies? Had Robert really seen me the way they did, as convenient, temporary, disposable? No. I thought about those final conversations, about the look in his eyes when he said I would be surprised. I thought about the way he had held my hand during those last weeks, the way he had whispered, "I love you," every night before sleep, the way he had made me promise to be strong. Margaret, he had said just 2 weeks before he died, you've given everything to this family. Everything. And some of them will never see that, never appreciate it. But I see it. I've always seen it. I had thought he was just being sentimental, emotional because of the medication and the pain. But now, hearing his children plan their inheritance like vultures dividing a carcass, I began to understand. Robert had seen exactly who they were. He had seen their indifference, their entitlement, their complete inability to value the woman who had sacrificed everything for their family. And if I knew my husband, and after 30 years I did, he had planned accordingly. The siblings finished their conversation and began to leave, each taking a moment to hug me goodbye and express their grief with practiced sincerity. Sarah held me a little too long, patting my back with false sympathy. "Don't worry, Margaret," she whispered. "We'll make sure you're taken care of." Condescension in her voice was breathtaking. The assumption that I would need their charity, their magnanimous gesture of throwing scraps to the woman who had raised them. After they left, I sat alone in the house that had been my home for 3 decades, surrounded by memories and photographs and the lingering scent of Robert's cologne. The silence was deafening. But in that silence I heard something else. Robert's voice from one of our last conversations. "They think they know everything," he had said, his words slightly slurred from the pain medication but his meaning crystal clear. "They think they have it all figured out. But Margaret, my love, they have no idea what we've really been planning. We. Not I. We." For months, while I had been focused on his medical care, on keeping him comfortable and fighting for every possible treatment, Robert had been working on something else entirely. Something he had kept from his children, something he had shared only with me in fragments, in whispered conversations during sleepless nights. Something that would change everything. The will reading was in 5 days. But they had no idea my husband and I had planned for this moment, planned for their greed, their dismissal, their absolute certainty that blood trumped love, that inheritance was a birthright rather than a choice. They had no idea at all. To understand what Robert had truly planned, I need to take you back to those final months when everything changed between us. When my husband's eyes were finally open to what I had been enduring for 30 years. Started in March, about 4 months before he died. Robert was having a good day. The new medication was managing his pain better, and he was sitting up in bed, actually eating solid food for the first time in weeks. The doorbell rang, and I went to answer it, expecting the nurse or maybe a delivery. Instead, it was Sarah and Michael making one of their rare visits. They didn't see Robert through the bedroom doorway, but he could see and hear everything from where he lay. "Oh, it's you," Sarah said when I opened the door, her tone making it clear I was not who she had hoped to find. "We came to see Dad," Michael added, barely looking at me. "How is he today?" "Much better," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "He'll be so happy to see you both." But as they walked past me, I heard Sarah mutter to Michael, "She looks terrible. All this stress is really aging her." "Well, it's not like she's actually family," Michael replied quietly. "She signed up for this when she married into money." They thought they were whispering. They thought Robert couldn't hear them from the bedroom. But those walls were thin and Robert's hearing was still sharp. I saw his face change. Saw something shift behind his eyes. A recognition, a dawning understanding of something he had been blind to for too long. That visit lasted barely 20 minutes. Sarah and Michael sat stiffly by Robert's bedside, making awkward conversation about their jobs and the weather while I bustled around, bringing them coffee and adjusting Robert's pillows. When they left, they barely acknowledged me beyond a perfunctory goodbye. After the front door closed, Robert was quiet for a long time. Too long. "How often does that happen?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I said, though I knew exactly what he meant. "How often do they treat you like hired help in your own home?" I tried to deflect, to make excuses for them the way I had been doing for years. "They're just worried about you, honey. Grief makes people say things they don't mean." But Robert wasn't buying it anymore. "Margaret, look at me." I met his eyes, and I saw something there I had never seen before. A fierce protectiveness, yes, but also guilt. Deep, painful guilt. "How long?" he asked. "How long have they been treating you this way?" The truth came pouring out then. 30 years of subtle slights, of being excluded from family photos, of conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The way they referred to Dad's house and Dad's money as if I had never contributed anything. The way they talked about their childhood as if I had never been part of it despite being there for half of their lives. "Why didn't you tell me?" Robert asked, and I could see tears forming in his tired eyes. "'Cause they're your children," I said simply. "I didn't want to put you in the middle. I hoped they would eventually accept me." 30 years, Margaret. 30 years you've been waiting for them to see what I see in you. That night, Robert made a phone call. The time, I thought he was calling his doctor about a change in medication. But I learned later that he had called his lawyer, James Morrison, a man who had been handling Robert's legal affairs for over 20 years. "Jim," I heard him say, "I need to make some changes to my will. Important changes. And I need to do it without my family knowing." Over the next few weeks, as I focused on Robert's medical care, he was quietly orchestrating something else entirely. Phone calls made when I was out running errands. Meetings with James that he scheduled during my brief trips to the grocery store or pharmacy. But Robert was careful to include me in the planning, piece by piece, during our late-night conversations when the pain medication made him more talkative. "They think they know me," he said one evening in April, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "They think because I built a successful business, because I provided for them, that I'm just like their grandfather, all about bloodlines and family legacy." "You do love your children," I reminded him gently. "Of course I do. But love doesn't mean being blind to who they really are. And it doesn't mean rewarding cruelty." He told me about the conversations he had been having with James, about the research they had been doing into estate planning, about the protections they were putting in place. "I've spent 30 years watching you give everything to this family," Robert said, taking my hand in his thin, cold fingers. "Your dreams, your career, your independence. You gave up everything, and they act like you're a stranger who wandered in off the street." "Robert, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted firmly. Margaret, do you know what they call you when they think I can't hear them? My heart sank. I don't want to know. Dad's second wife. Not their stepmother. Not part of the family. Dad's second wife, like you're some kind of temporary arrangement. The words stung because they were true. After all these years, after all I had given, I was still just Robert's second wife to them. An outsider who had never truly earned her place at their table. Well, Robert said, his voice gaining strength, they're about to learn exactly how temporary they think I am. In May, as Robert's condition worsened, the secret planning intensified. James Morrison began making house calls, bringing documents for Robert to review and sign. They were always careful to schedule these visits when the children weren't around, when I was the only witness. This isn't about revenge, Robert explained to me one afternoon after James had left. This is about justice. This is about making sure that the person who truly deserves to be taken care of actually is. But they're your children, I said again, the same argument I had been making for weeks. And you're my wife, Robert replied firmly. My partner. My choice. They'll inherit from me, but on my terms, not theirs. Plan was elaborate, carefully constructed, and absolutely brilliant. James had helped Robert create a will that would teach his children the lesson they had spent 30 years refusing to learn. They want to act like you don't exist? Robert said, a slight smile playing at his lips despite the pain. Like you're not really family? Then they can live with the consequences of that choice. By June, everything was in place. Robert had signed the new will, witnessed and notarized, filed safely in James Morrison's office. The old will, the one the children had seen years ago, the one they were counting on, was now worthless. But Robert wasn't finished. I want them to show you exactly who they are, he told me during one of our last real conversations. I want their true nature on full display before justice is served. What do you mean? You'll see, he said, squeezing my hand weakly. Trust me, Margaret. Just trust me. Robert died on July 15th, a hot Tuesday morning with the summer sun streaming through our bedroom windows. I held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering that I loved him, that I would miss him every day for the rest of my life. His last words to me were, "Remember what we planned, my love. Remember and be strong." The will reading was scheduled for the following week, just as Robert had arranged with James Morrison. 7 days for the children to reveal their true colors, to show me exactly what they thought of the woman who had loved them and their father for 3 decades. 7 days for them to prove that every provision in Robert's new will was absolutely justified. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought they had it all figured out. But they had never really known Robert at all. The days leading up to the will reading were like watching a perfectly choreographed performance of greed and entitlement. Each of Robert's children played their role flawlessly, never suspecting they were walking directly into the trap their father had set for them. Monday, 3 days before the reading, Sarah showed up at my door with a casserole and what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. "I brought you some dinner," she said, stepping into the foyer like she owned the place. "I know how hard this must be for you." But her eyes weren't on me. They were scanning the living room, taking inventory. She lingered by Robert's antique grandfather clock, the one that had belonged to his father. "This old thing must have so many memories," she said, running her fingers along the polished wood. "I remember Grandpa winding it every Sunday when I was little." "Your father loved that clock," I replied carefully. "He wound it every Sunday too, just like his father did." "Well, someone should keep up the tradition," Sarah said meaningfully. "It needs to stay in the family, you know. The real family." There it was again. The real family. Constant reminder that despite 30 years of marriage, despite raising these children as my own, I would never truly belong. "Of course," I said quietly, and Sarah seemed satisfied with my submissive response. Tuesday brought Michael and Jessica, ostensibly to check on me, but really to scout the house more thoroughly. While Michael kept me occupied with small talk about funeral arrangements, Jessica wandered freely through the rooms, her sharp eyes cataloging everything valuable. "Robert had such wonderful taste," Jessica said, admiring the dining room set we had purchased together for our 10th anniversary. "This table would look perfect in our new house." "We're thinking of upgrading," Michael added smoothly. "You know, with the inheritance coming, we can finally afford that bigger place we've been wanting." The inheritance coming. As if it were already theirs, already decided, already divided among the three of them. "I'm sure your father would want you to be comfortable," I said, playing my part perfectly. "Oh, don't worry about us," Jessica laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "We'll be more than comfortable. And of course, we'll make sure you're taken care of too. Maybe a nice little apartment somewhere, nothing too expensive." A nice little apartment. After 30 years in this house, after building this life with Robert, they were already planning to relocate me to some modest corner where I wouldn't be an inconvenience. Wednesday was David's turn. Sweet David, my baby, the one who had crawled into my lap when he was 8 years old and told me he wished I was his real mother. Now 38, married with children of his own, he sat in Robert's favorite chair and laid out his plans for the inheritance with the casual entitlement of someone who had never questioned his right to it. "I've been thinking about the cars," he said, scrolling through his phone. "The Corvettes, I mean. I know Dad loved those cars, but honestly, what are you going to do with 3 vintage sports cars?" "I hadn't really thought about it," I admitted. "Well, you shouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing," David said generously. "Cars need maintenance, insurance, proper storage. That's a man's responsibility. I'll take care of all that for you." How thoughtful of him. Taking care of me by taking away everything his father had loved. "And the house," David continued. "It's really too big for one person, don't you think? All those rooms, all that upkeep. Wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller, more manageable?" Happier. As if being forced out of my home of 30 years would be a gift they were giving me. Each conversation was the same. Each visit was another layer of condescension disguised as concern. They spoke to me like I was a confused elderly relative who needed their guidance to navigate the complicated world of money and property. But through it all, I remembered Robert's words. Let them show you who they really are. They were showing me, all right. They were putting their greed and entitlement on full display, never once considering that I might have rights, that I might have been provided for, that their father might have valued my 30 years of devotion more than their biological connection to him. Thursday morning, the day before the will reading, all 3 siblings met at my house. They probably thought they were being subtle, but I could hear them in the kitchen, dividing up their inheritance like children splitting Halloween candy. "I want the grandfather clock and the dining room set," Sarah was saying. "They've been in the family forever." "Fine, but I get the cars," David replied. "All 3 of them. Dad always said I had the best appreciation for classic automobiles." "What about the house?" Michael asked. "We need to be practical about this. Margaret's going to need time to find a new place, pack up her things." 2 months should be plenty, Sarah said dismissively. "It's not like she has 30 years worth of belongings. Most of this stuff was Dad's anyway. Most of this stuff was Dad's. As if I had been living in their father's house like a tenant, contributing nothing, owning nothing, belonging nowhere." "We should probably get the house appraised right away," Jessica added. "The sooner we can put it on the market, the sooner we can settle the estate." They had it all figured out. Down to the last detail. The house would be sold, the proceeds divided among the 3 of them. The cars, the furniture, the artwork, the family heirlooms, all of it distributed according to their own sense of entitlement. And me? I would be graciously allowed to keep my personal belongings and relocate to somewhere more appropriate for a woman in my position. A woman in my position. The widow of the man they were so eager to profit from. That evening, I sat alone in the house that would soon be too big for one person, surrounded by the memories they were so eager to auction off. I thought about Robert, about our secret conversations, about the plan we had made together. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow, James Morrison would read Robert's will in his law office downtown. Tomorrow, Sarah and Michael and David would discover that blood might be thicker than water, but love and respect were thicker than blood. Tomorrow, they would learn that their father had been watching them for 30 years, just as I had been enduring them for 30 years. Tomorrow, justice would finally be served. I went to bed that night with a mixture of grief and anticipation that made sleep impossible. Robert had been gone for less than a week, and I missed him with an ache that felt like physical pain. But alongside the grief was something else, a quiet, growing excitement about what the morning would bring. Children thought they knew their father. They thought they understood what family meant to him, what loyalty meant, what love meant. James Morrison's law office was everything you would expect from a man who had been practicing estate law for 40 years. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books lining the walls, heavy mahogany furniture that spoke of old money and older traditions. Conference room where we gathered that Friday morning felt more like a courtroom than a place for family business. I arrived first, as I always did for important appointments. Punctuality had been drilled into me by years of managing Robert's schedule, coordinating his business meetings, making sure everything in our life ran smoothly. James greeted me with the gentle sympathy of a man who had known my husband for decades. "Margaret," he said, taking my hands in his. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I replied, though the truth was more complicated. The grief was still overwhelming, but underneath it was something else, a nervous energy that made my hands shake and my heart race. "Your husband was a good man," James said quietly. "A very good man who loved you deeply." There was something in his tone, a weight to his words that made me look at him more carefully. But before I could respond, the conference room door opened and the children began to arrive. Sarah entered first, dressed in what I recognized as her most expensive black suit, the one she wore to important business meetings. She had styled her hair in a severe bun and carried herself with the air of someone attending a board meeting rather than her father's while reading. "James," she said coolly, shaking the lawyer's hand. "Thank you for accommodating our schedules." Michael and Jessica arrived together, both of them looking like they had dressed for a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. Michael wore his best suit, the one he usually reserved for client presentations. Jessica had chosen a dress that was just a shade too bright for the somber occasion. David came last, apologizing for running late because of traffic. But I could see the excitement in his eyes, the barely contained anticipation that made his usual easy smile seem forced and artificial. We took our seats around the polished conference table. Sarah sat directly across from James, as if positioning herself as the family spokesperson. Michael and Jessica flanked her on one side, while David took the chair next to them. I sat at the end of the table, physically separated from the group, just as I had been emotionally separated from this family for 30 years. James opened a thick manila folder and pulled out several documents. The room fell silent except for the soft whisper of papers being arranged and the distant hum of traffic outside the windows. "We're here today for the reading of Robert Charles Morrison's last will and testament," James began formally. The will was executed on June 20th of this year, witnessed and notarized according to state law. June 20th. Just a month before Robert died. The children didn't know about the timing, didn't understand the significance, but I remembered that day clearly. Robert had been having a good week, alert and focused despite the pain medication. He had insisted on getting dressed in his favorite shirt and tie for the appointment, as if signing his will was a formal occasion that demanded respect. "I'll be reading the relevant portions of the will today," James continued. Robert was very specific about how he wanted this done. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. "Of course. We appreciate you handling this so professionally." "The will begins with some personal bequests," James said, adjusting his reading glasses. "To my daughter Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I leave my father's gold pocket watch in the sum of $50,000. Sarah's face lit up with satisfaction. $50,000 was more than she had expected for a personal bequest, and the pocket watch was a family heirloom she had always coveted. "To my son Michael Robert Morrison," James continued, "I leave my collection of rare books in the sum of $50,000. Michael squeezed Jessica's hand under the table. I could see him calculating in his head. 50,000 plus his share of the estate would set them up nicely for that bigger house they had been discussing. To my son David James Morrison, I leave my workshop tools and the sum of $50,000. David's smile was genuine for the first time all week. He had always loved working with his hands, had spent countless hours in Robert's garage learning to restore those vintage cars. Tools were a sentimental choice that actually meant something to him. "These are wonderful gestures," Sarah said, speaking for the group. "Dad was always so thoughtful about family history and personal connections." Children exchanged pleased glances. $150,000 in personal bequests was generous, especially since they assumed they would be splitting the bulk of the estate, the house, the cars, the investments, the life insurance. Everything that really mattered. "Now," James said, turning to a new page, "we come to the disposition of the real estate." This was what they had been waiting for. The house alone was worth nearly $1 million, and they had already planned how to divide the proceeds. Sarah would get the largest share as the eldest child, but they would all benefit substantially. "I leave the family home at 412 Maple Street, along with all furnishings and household goods, to my beloved wife Margaret and Morrison." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. Sarah's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, what?" "The house goes to Margaret," James repeated calmly. "All of it?" Michael asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "All of it," James confirmed. "The property, the furnishings, everything inside the house." I kept my face carefully neutral, but inside my heart was racing. This was just the beginning. Jessica leaned forward aggressively. "There must be some mistake. The house has been in Robert's family for generations. It should go to his children." "I'm reading directly from the will," James said firmly. "There is no mistake." "But surely," David said, his voice strained, "surely Dad intended for us to inherit the family home. Margaret could live there, of course, but the ownership—" "The ownership goes entirely to Margaret," James interrupted. Robert was very clear about this. Sarah's composure was beginning to crack. "This doesn't make sense. Dad always talked about keeping the house and the family. The real family. The real family." There it was again, that phrase they had used so casually for so many years. But now, in this formal setting with legal documents that proved otherwise, it sounded petty and desperate. "Margaret is his family," James said quietly. "She was his wife for 30 years. "She was his second wife," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "We are his children. His blood." James looked at her over his reading glasses with the patience of a man who had dealt with difficult families for decades. "The law recognizes Mrs. Morrison as Mr. Morrison's surviving spouse and primary beneficiary." "What about the cars?" David asked desperately. "The Corvettes? Dad always said I would inherit those cars." James turned to another page. "The vintage automobile collection is also left to Margaret." "That's impossible," David said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "Those cars are worth over $200,000. Dad wouldn't leave them to someone who doesn't even drive stick shift." "Nevertheless," James said calmly, "that is what the will states." The room was beginning to feel smaller, the air thicker. I could see the panic starting to set in on their faces as their carefully planned inheritance began to slip away. "What about the investments?" Michael demanded. "The retirement accounts? The life insurance?" "I'm getting to that," James said, turning to yet another page. But Sarah had heard enough. She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she declared. "Erase her name. This will has obviously been tampered with. Dad was sick, he was on medication, he wasn't thinking clearly. Someone took advantage of him." Her eyes turned to me with an accusation so sharp it could have cut glass. "She manipulated him. She waited until he was vulnerable and changed everything. Mrs. Morrison, James said firmly, I need you to sit down and allow me to finish reading the will. I will not sit down, Sarah snapped. I will not listen to any more of this travesty. My father would never have left everything to her. She practically spat the last word, as if my very existence was an insult to her father's memory. But James Morrison was not a man easily intimidated. He had been practicing law longer than Sarah had been alive, and he had seen every kind of family drama imaginable. Mrs. Morrison, he said again, his voice carrying the authority of decades in courtrooms, your father's will was properly executed with full witnesses and notarization. He was of sound mind and body when he signed it. And if you'll allow me to continue reading, you'll understand exactly why he made the choices he did. Sarah reluctantly sat back down, but her face was rigid with fury. The other children looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite process what they were hearing. Now, James said, straightening the papers with deliberate calm, for the final provisions of Robert's will. But then the lawyer said something that made the entire room fall silent, something that would change everything we thought we knew about Robert's final wishes. James Morrison removed his reading glasses, cleaned them carefully, and put them back on. The gesture was deliberate, calculated to draw out the tension in the room. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute finality. The remainder of Robert's estate, he began slowly, including all investment accounts, retirement funds, life insurance policies, and liquid assets totaling approximately $2.4 million, is left entirely to his wife, Margaret and Morrison. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Michael was the first to find his voice. 2.4 million? All of it? All of it, James confirmed. David's face had gone completely white. That's impossible. Dad wouldn't do that. He wouldn't cut us out of everything. You haven't been cut out, James said calmly. You each received $50,000 plus the personal items I mentioned. 50,000? Sarah's voice was shrill with disbelief. 50,000 out of nearly $3 million? That is correct. Jessica stood up so quickly she knocked over her water glass, sending liquid spreading across the polished table. This is insane. We're his children. His blood. We should be getting equal shares. Furthermore, James continued, ignoring her outburst, your father included specific conditions regarding your bequests. The room fell silent again. Even I hadn't known about conditions. The $50,000 left to each of you will only be disbursed if you meet certain requirements set forth by your father. What kind of requirements? Michael demanded. James consulted another document. Each of you must write a formal letter of apology to Margaret, acknowledging the ways you have disrespected her over the years and asking for her forgiveness. Sarah's mouth fell open. You've got to be kidding me. Additionally, James continued, you must agree to treat Margaret with the respect and dignity befitting your father's widow and your stepmother. Any future displays of disrespect or attempts to contest this shall result in immediate forfeiture of your inheritance. This is blackmail, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is your father's final wish, James replied firmly. I won't do it, Sarah declared, standing up again. I will not apologize to that woman for anything. She's the one who manipulated our father, who poisoned him against his own children. Then you forfeit your inheritance, James said simply. Fine, Sarah screamed. Keep the money. I don't want anything from a will that was obviously forged. Mrs. Morrison, James said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, I must warn you that accusations of fraud are serious legal matters. Are you prepared to make such accusations formally? Sarah's lawyer instincts kicked in, and she realized she was treading on dangerous ground. I know. Not formally. But this isn't what Dad wanted. This can't be what he wanted. Actually, James said, reaching into his briefcase, your father anticipated that you might feel this way. He left something for this specific moment. He pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it in the center of the table. Robert recorded this message specifically for today, to be played only if his children questioned his decisions. My heart stopped. I had known about the will changes, but I hadn't known about a recording. James pressed play, and suddenly Robert's voice filled the room. His voice, weak but determined, speaking from beyond the grave to the children who had so thoroughly disappointed him. "If you're hearing this message," Robert's familiar voice began, "it means you're upset about my will. It means you're questioning why I left the bulk of my estate to Margaret instead of dividing it equally among my children." Sarah sank back into her chair, her face pale with shock. "The answer is simple," Robert continued. "For 30 years, I watched Margaret give everything to this family. Everything. She gave up her career, her dreams, her independence to raise you, to support me, to build the life we shared together." David's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "And for 30 years, I watched you treat her like an outsider, like hired help, like someone who didn't belong in our family despite being the most loving, selfless person any of us have ever known." Michael closed his eyes, but he couldn't shut out his father's words. "Sarah, you excluded her from family photos. You introduced her as Dad's wife instead of your stepmother. You made it clear at every opportunity that she wasn't really family." Sarah's composure cracked completely, and tears began streaming down her face. "Michael, you talked about Dad's house and Dad's money as if Margaret had contributed nothing to our family's success. As if the woman who supported my career for 3 decades had no claim to what we built together." Michael's face flushed with shame. "David, my sweet boy, you broke my heart the most. Margaret raised you from age 8. She was more of a mother to you than your biological mother ever was. And yet you treated her like a stranger when it came to family matters." David put his head in his hands and began to cry. "In my final months," Robert's voice continued, growing stronger despite his obvious weakness, "I listened to you plan my funeral as if Margaret wouldn't be there. I heard you discuss my belongings as if she had no right to them. I watched you treat the woman I love like an inconvenience you'd have to deal with after I was gone." The recording paused, and we could hear Robert taking a labored breath before continuing. "So, yes, I changed my will. I left everything to the person who deserves it most. The person who loved me unconditionally, who cared for me without expectation of reward, who gave up everything for a family that never truly accepted her." Jessica was crying now too, her earlier anger replaced by crushing realization. "If you're angry about this decision, if you think it's unfair, then you've proven exactly why I made it. If you can't understand why the woman who sacrificed 30 years of her life for us deserves to be taken care of, then you don't understand what family really means." The recording continued for another minute, with Robert expressing his love for his children despite his disappointment in them. He ended with a plea for them to finally see Margaret for who she truly was, not an outsider who had stolen their father, but the woman who had loved them all more than they had ever deserved. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Even James Morrison seemed moved by the power of Robert's final message. I sat there with tears streaming down my face, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming love I felt for my husband. Even in death, he was protecting me, defending me, making sure I was taken care of. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "He really meant it." "Every word," James confirmed. "We were so awful to her," David said, his voice breaking. "All these years we were so awful." Michael looked across the table at me with eyes full of regret. "Margaret, we didn't. I'm so sorry." But Sarah wasn't ready for apologies yet. She stood up one more time, her face a mixture of grief and fury and something that might have been shame. "This doesn't change anything," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "She's still not our real mother. She's still not blood family." "Then you still don't understand," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. "Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Respect does. Being there for each other does." I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and the copies of documents James had prepared for me. Your father tried to teach you that for 30 years, I continued. I tried to show you that for 30 years. But you never wanted to learn. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. The money, the house, the cars, none of that matters to me as much as what your father said in that recording. He saw me. He valued me. He loved me. That's worth more than all the inheritance in the world. As I reached for the door handle, David called out behind me. Margaret, wait. Please. Can we try again? Can we start over? I paused, my hand on the door, thinking about Robert's conditions for their inheritance. Thinking about second chances and the possibility of redemption. That depends, I said softly, on whether you're willing to earn it. And with that, I walked out of James Morrison's office, leaving behind 30 years of trying to prove I belonged in a family that had never wanted me. But now I didn't need their acceptance anymore. I had something far more valuable. I had justice. I didn't leave immediately. Something made me pause just outside the conference room door, my hands still on the handle, listening to the chaos erupting behind me. This is all your fault. Sarah was screaming at Michael. You told me Dad agreed with us about her. You said he understood that blood comes first. I never said that. Michael shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. I said I thought he understood. I thought he felt the same way we did. Well, you thought wrong. David's voice was thick with tears. We all thought wrong. We've been horrible to her for 30 years and Dad saw everything. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered back into the room. What I saw there was the complete breakdown of three people who had built their entire identity around being the real family, only to discover that family had nothing to do with genetics. Sarah was pacing frantically, her perfect composure completely shattered. How could he do this to us? How could he choose her over his own children? He didn't choose her over us, David said quietly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. He chose love over hate. He chose kindness over cruelty. Don't you dare lecture me. Sarah whirled on her youngest brother. You're just as guilty as the rest of us. You called her a gold digger at Dad's funeral. I know what I said. David's voice broke completely. And I'll never forgive myself for it. She raised me. She was there for every soccer game, every school play, every broken heart. And I repaid her by treating her like garbage. Jessica, who had been silent since the recording ended, finally spoke up. Michael, your father was right about everything. Every single thing he said in that recording was true. I know, Michael whispered, his head in his hands. Oh God, I know. We talked about selling her house, Jessica continued, her voice filled with horror at the memory. We planned to put her in some little apartment like we were doing her a favor. We counted his money like it was already ours. It should have been ours, Sarah insisted, but her voice lacked conviction now. We're his children. So what? David demanded, standing up to face his sister. So what if we're his children? What did we ever do to earn it? What did we ever do except take and take and take? We're family, Sarah said desperately. Margaret is family too. David shot back. She's been family for 30 years. She earned her place in this family every single day, and we never gave it to her. James Morrison cleared his throat from behind his desk. If I may interrupt, he said gently, there's something else you should know about your father's planning. The three siblings turned to him with expressions of dread, as if they couldn't bear to hear any more revelations. Your father didn't just change his will in those final months, James continued. He had been documenting your behavior toward Margaret for years. Sarah sank back into her chair. What do you mean, documenting? He kept a journal, James explained, pulling another folder from his briefcase. Notes about conversations he overheard, incidents he witnessed, things Margaret told him about how you treated her when he wasn't around. How long? Michael asked hoarsely. The earliest entry is from 1995, James said. 2 years after he married Margaret. 1995, I remembered that year. That was when Sarah graduated from college and made it clear that she didn't want me in any of the family photos from the ceremony. Robert had seemed hurt at the time, but I thought it was just about missing the photo opportunity. He knew, David whispered. All this time he knew how we treated her. He hoped you would change, James said, consulting the journal. There are entries where he writes about giving you more time to mature, to realize what Margaret meant to the family. But instead, your behavior got worse over the years. Worse how? Sarah asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. James flipped through several pages. The entry from your wedding, Sarah, mentions how you seated Margaret at a back table with people she didn't know, while your biological mother sat in the front row. Sarah's face went white. I remembered that wedding. I had helped pay for the flowers and the catering because Robert's business was going through a rough patch. But when it came time for the ceremony, I was relegated to the role of distant relative while his ex-wife was treated as the honored mother of the bride. The entry from Michael's business school graduation, James continued, talks about how you introduced Margaret as my father's wife to your classmates instead of as your stepmother. Michael was crying openly now. I was embarrassed, he admitted. I was ashamed that my friends would think my family was complicated. I wanted them to think we were this perfect nuclear family. And David, James said gently, there are multiple entries about how you would call looking for money for various expenses, but you would always ask to speak to your father directly, never asking Margaret how she was doing or acknowledging her presence in your life. I thought she was just the person who answered the phone, David sobbed. I thought she was just there. I never thought about her feelings. I never thought about her at all. The room fell silent except for the sound of David crying and the distant hum of traffic outside. Your father loved you, James said finally. Every entry in this journal mentions his love for you. But he also loved Margaret, and he couldn't stand watching her be hurt by the people she had sacrificed everything to love. I stepped fully back into the room then, letting the door close behind me. All 3 siblings looked up at me with expressions of shame and regret so profound it was almost painful to witness. Margaret, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. We all are, Michael added, standing up as if he might approach me, then thinking better of it. What we did to you, there's no excuse for it. I know you probably can't forgive us, David said, wiping his eyes. I know we don't deserve forgiveness. But please know that we understand now. We understand what we lost. I looked at these 3 people who had shaped so much of my adult life, who had caused me so much pain, who had made me question my worth for 30 years. They looked broken, completely devastated by the realization of what their behavior had cost them. You want to know the worst part? I said quietly, and they all leaned forward as if my words might offer some hope of redemption. The worst part is that I would have loved you anyway. I would have loved you even if you had never accepted me, even if you had never called me mom, even if you had never seen me as family. 'Cause that's what love is. It doesn't require anything in return. Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. But you couldn't even let me love you, I continued. You couldn't even let me exist in your lives without resentment. You treated me like I was stealing something from you, when all I ever wanted was to give you more love than you knew what to do with. We were stupid, Michael said desperately. We were selfish and stupid and we ruined everything. You didn't ruin everything, I said, surprising them all. You ruined your relationship with me and you broke your father's heart, but you didn't ruin everything. I walked closer to the table, looking at each of them in turn. Your father left you a choice, I said. He left you the chance to learn, to grow, to become the people he always hoped you could be. The question is, what are you going to do with that chance? What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean, I said, pulling out one of the chairs and sitting down across from them, that your father's conditions weren't just about apologizing to me. They were about becoming better people. People who understand what family really means. Are you saying... David started, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying that if you really want to honor your father's memory, if you really want to make amends for 30 years of cruelty, you can start by proving that you've learned something from this experience. I looked around the table at their tear-stained faces, at the hope beginning to flicker in their eyes. But understand this, I said firmly. I don't need your apologies to make me feel better about myself. I don't need your acceptance to validate my place in this family. Your father already did that. I stood up, smoothing down my black dress, the same dress I had worn to his funeral just a week ago. If you choose to write those letters, if you choose to try to rebuild what you destroyed, it won't be for me. It will be for you. It will be because you finally understand what your father spent 30 years trying to teach you. I walked toward the door one more time, then paused and looked back. Love isn't something you earn through genetics, I said. It's something you choose every day. For 30 years, I chose to love you despite everything. Now it's your turn to choose. And this time, when I walked out of that conference room, I knew I was walking into a completely different life. A life where I finally understood my own worth. A life where justice had been served. 6 months have passed since that devastating day in James Morrison's office. 6 months since Robert's voice reached across the grave to defend the woman he loved and expose the children who had disappointed him so deeply. The house feels different now. Still the same 4 walls, the same rooms where I built a life with Robert, but the atmosphere has changed completely. For the first time in 30 years, this feels like truly my home, not a place where I was graciously allowed to exist. I've made some changes. Small ones, but meaningful ones. I moved Robert's favorite chair from the living room to the sunroom, where I can sit and read in the morning light that always made him smile. I planted a memorial garden in the backyard, filled with the roses he loved and the herbs I always wanted to grow but never had time for when I was so busy taking care of everyone else. The money, that $2.4 million that caused such chaos, has become something beautiful. Something Robert would have been proud of. I established the Robert Morrison Foundation for Stepfamilies, a charity that provides counseling and support for blended families struggling with acceptance and integration. The irony isn't lost on me that my husband's money, left to me because his children couldn't accept me, is now helping other families avoid the same mistakes. Every month, I receive letters from stepmothers and stepfathers who felt invisible in their own homes, from children who learned to embrace their bonus parents, from families who chose love over biology. These letters remind me that our story, painful as it was, has meaning beyond our own family's drama. I've also gone back to teaching. 62, I thought my career was over, but it turns out there's a demand for experienced educators who understand what it means to love children who aren't biologically yours. I work part-time at a local elementary school, and every day I see the difference that unconditional love can make in a child's life. As for Robert's children, the aftermath has been complicated. David was the first to write his letter of apology. It arrived 3 weeks after the will reading, handwritten on his personal stationery, 12 pages of raw honesty about his behavior and his regrets. He didn't just apologize, he took responsibility. He acknowledged specific instances where he had hurt me, specific ways he had failed to see my sacrifices, specific moments when he chose cruelty over kindness. But more than that, he acted on his words. David started bringing his children, my step-grandchildren, to visit every Sunday. For the first time in their young lives, they're getting to know their grandfather's widow as Grandma Margaret instead of Dad's wife. These children, unburdened by the prejudices their parents carried, accepted me immediately and completely. Last month, David asked if he could restore one of Robert's vintage Corvettes in the garage, the way he used to when he was a teenager. We spent a beautiful Saturday afternoon working on the engine together, talking about Robert, sharing memories, building something new from the ashes of what we had lost. Michael took longer to come around. His letter arrived 2 months after David's, and it was more formal, more careful. He apologized for his behavior, but with the measured language of someone still protecting himself from full vulnerability. Till he meant it, and that was a start. He and Jessica have begun including me in family events again. Not as the honored guest, not as the center of attention, but as a genuine member of the family. Last month, they invited me to their daughter's piano recital. When little Emma finished her performance, she ran to hug both her parents, and then, to my complete surprise, she ran to hug me too. "Grandma Margaret," she said, "did you like my song?" Grandma Margaret. Not Mrs. Morrison. Not Dad's wife. Grandma Margaret. I cried all the way home that night, but they were happy tears. Sarah has been the most resistant to change. She never wrote the letter. She never claimed her $50,000. Her pride, it seems, is worth more to her than money or family reconciliation. But even Sarah has surprised me. 2 weeks ago she called. Not to apologize, not to ask for anything, but to tell me that her teenage daughter had been asking questions about her grandfather's funeral, about the woman who sat in the front row next to his casket. "I told her the truth," Sarah said quietly over the phone. "I told her that you were the most important person in Grandpa's life, and that I had been too stupid to see it. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. It was progress. Would she like to visit sometime?" I asked gently. I have so many pictures of her grandfather that I'd love to share. There was a long pause. Then, she would like that very much. Small steps. But steps nonetheless. The grief has evolved too. In those first months after Robert died, the pain was so acute I could barely breathe. Now, 6 months later, the sharp edges have softened into something more manageable. I still miss him every day. I still wake up sometimes reaching for his hand in the bed beside me. But alongside the sadness is gratitude. Gratitude for 30 years of love, gratitude for his final act of protection, gratitude for the chance to finally understand my own worth. I've started writing again, something I gave up decades ago when I chose to prioritize everyone else's dreams over my own. It's just a small memoir about love and loss and learning to value yourself, but my editor thinks it might help other people who feel invisible in their own families. The title is Seen, a Love Story. Because that's what Robert's final gift really was. He saw me. After 30 years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and tolerated, my husband made sure the whole world could see that I mattered. People ask me if I'm angry about the wasted years, about the energy I spent trying to earn acceptance that should have been freely given. Truth is, I'm not angry anymore. Those years weren't wasted, they were preparation. They taught me resilience, compassion, and the difference between conditional and unconditional love. They also taught me that family isn't about sharing DNA. It's about showing up. It's about choosing each other every day, especially when it's difficult. It's about seeing the good in people even when they can't see it in themselves. Some of Robert's children learned that lesson. Some are still learning. And some may never learn it at all. But that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to live the life Robert wanted me to have, a life where I'm valued, where I'm seen, where I understand my own worth. A life where I can help other people learn to see themselves the way love sees them. Every morning, I sit in Robert's chair in the sunroom with my coffee and watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. Every morning, I remember his voice from that recording. "She was more of a mother to you than your biological mother ever was. He saw me. He valued me. He loved me enough to protect me even after death. And now, finally, I see myself the way he always did." If you're listening to this story and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever questioned your worth because others couldn't see your value, I want you to know something important. You matter. Your love matters. Your sacrifices matter. Family isn't about blood, it's about choice. It's about respect. It's about showing up for each other with kindness and compassion. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? If you have ever been underestimated by people who should have valued you and had to fight for your place at a table where you deserve to sit, I'd love to hear your story. Let's meet in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, it encourages me to keep bringing more stories like this. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.